Here we go. So this CARS, or Create a Research Space, actually came out of sociolinguistic research. So it wasn't developed as a kind of a prescription. It came from careful observation of many articles through sociolinguists, and Swales is best known for this. But I actually, others have found it quite useful as a mechanism for understanding what we're doing and actually implementing it. And this has 3 moves: establishing a territory, identifying a gap or a niche, and occupying the niche. This links in closely to what Stella and Simon and others were raising yesterday about how we show the significance of what we're doing and how we link in our work to the global debates. So the first move, establishing a territory. So this is, and normally you would move through in this sequence, in your introduction or in the way that you're presenting your ideas, possibly in an abstract. So first you tell the reader what is the field in which you're working, okay? What is the territory here? So is it debates around, how internationalization is realized in universities in different parts of the world, right? Or is it causes of dropout, or is it a theoretical debate? What is the territory on which we're working here? So it's just delineating. So you're putting borders around the scope of what you're doing. The second move is to identify a gap. Now that might be in a literal way of an aspect of this that has not yet been researched. So it could be, theorists researchers have been focusing on this, but they've completely ignored this aspect of the question, which is important. It's not necessarily a gap in that sense. So it might be a contradiction, so that you've got, warring parties, and it hasn't been resolved yet. Or it could be that it's been researched in some contexts in particular ways, but not in others, or a perspective is missing. Maybe one stakeholder hasn't been, the view of a particular, quite often you find in educational research that nobody's bothered to ask students or teachers about a very important issue that they have a bearing on. And then the final move is to occupy it. And the key thing here is that you, not only to do it, but to also tell the reader that you're going to do it and that you have done it. So you have to affirm the way in which you're going to address this issue, because that's part of the, how you sell the value of what you're going to do. Is it because you found a new theoretical tool that will help us to resolve the contradiction in these debates, or simply carrying out an empirical piece of research that hasn't been done? So one way of framing what we're doing in an introduction, I find this particularly useful for writing introductions, is to follow through these stages. What is the territory on which we're working? So some kind of broad overview of the particular debates or policy area or practice area that we're engaging with. Then you move on to what the problem is. There's usually some kind of need for your research. Is it a gap? Is it a contradiction? Is it so forth? And then how you're going to occupy it. And you tell the reader, and that's you've given the rationale for your article, and you've also shown the reader early on what your contribution is going to be. So that's the CARS framework, which can be useful for us. Don't worry, it's fine. I'll do it. They're in a different order now. It's not working now. So just a few. Sorry, the text is a little bit small in this, but is it working now? Okay, thanks. A few pointers on titles. So titles are important. I would say that the importance of the title varies a little bit depending on what your output is going to be. I tend to think that if you're writing a PhD thesis, the title is not very, very important, because nothing stands and falls in it. If you're writing a book, particularly if you're writing a book for the popular market, the title is incredibly important. If I think about discussions with publishers of my own books, they've never been too bothered about the content, but we have endless back and forth on what the title's going to be. So in that market, it's important. In articles, it's important. It's something to stress about terribly, but it is an important thing. And just a few of my own, my own personal tips would be to include important terms. So these are all very obvious things. An interesting debate that was raised yesterday is about whether you need to include the country in which it's carried out. And I think that's a really interesting discussion, isn't it? And it's a really good point that if you're writing in the USA, you probably wouldn't bother to put it in. But if you're writing in Burundi, you would. Now, whether that's fair or appropriate is a very difficult question. I think it depends on whether the contextual is an important aspect of what you're doing. If it really matters that it's, you're looking at Nevada or you're looking at Mongolia, then it's appropriate for it to be there. If the context is not important for what you're doing, then it perhaps not. So be concise and precise. And then I'll link this to avoid repetition. So like a mathematical formula, you want to, or any kind of equation, you want to reduce it to the smallest number of essential elements. So you've got to have a very good reason ever to repeat a word in a title. The rule of thumb is never, ever repeat a word, even if it's across the main first part and the second part, because it's usually unnecessary. I mean, rhetorically, it looks a little bit ugly as well, but it's also, you can usually reduce the size of it by not repeating a term. Yeah. Be as concise as you can, but including all of the important elements. I mean, hugely long titles are quite cumbersome and they don't really help us. So I put here can be poetic but not obligatory. It depends a little bit in what sphere you're working. So post-structural theorists love all these word plays and puns and so forth. It's almost essential to do that if you're working in particular kinds of fields, right? I'll give you an example of a title of an article I read recently. So, and quite often, in qualitative research, quite often you will have a really interesting enigmatic quotation in the first bit, and then the second bit is the really technical description of what you're going on. So that's quite a common kind of title. So the one I read recently is just a wordplay, with or without you, the U2 song, but the U bit is just U for university, and then the subtitle is something like ontological prevarication in sort of contemporary higher education systems. So you often have this contrast between the sort of faux kind of popular and then the very technical intellectual bit. You don't need to get into all of this. It can be a very straight, simple title. In fact, some of the most powerful titles are incredibly simple and short. So don't feel sort of pressured to have a hugely long and sort of clever-sounding title. Simple titles can be really, really good, as long as you've included all the essential information. And, there is also an exposure thing here. People will find your article through word searches very often. And if you've missed out an important aspect of it, somebody might not find your article. So there is an argument then, for not using something that's a little bit wacky and doesn't include actually the keywords that people need. Is there anything else on titles? Do anyone want to add in anything on titles before we move on? Yeah.
Sometimes you come up with a title like a question.
A question? Yeah, I mean, I quite like a question. I mean, question titles work quite well in philosophy. They might work for other areas as well, but yeah. I mean, certainly, you can present it as a question. I say it's a minority of titles of academic journals. But yeah. That sounds good, yeah. Yes?
There are some titles that are seen, they explicitly make reference to the relationship being studied, like dependent variables, if at all, are related inside the article, you can see that right at the top of the
So-
title. While others, they just indicate the variables, comma, and leave it that way. So, could you
Do you-
provide guidance on which way?
Do you mean almost you're putting the conclusion in the title?
Not the conclusion, but how the variables are related. For example, someone would be saying moderating relationships, or the effect of this and this, or the relationship between this and this, while another person would just write A, comma, B, and this. So what type of guidance can you provide here?
There might be some disciplinary differences here in expectation, but I wouldn't think it was necessary to specify the type of relationship in the title necessarily. As long as the keywords are there, you would need to in the abstract though. So the abstract you would need to specify what your findings are specifically and what relationships it is. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Please.
I think in management area you would have a title that says the positive relationship between leadership and organization. You don't put, you would say the relationship between leadership and moral commitment, moderating variables, something like that. You don't normally put the conclusion. It's more general. It's almost like a descriptive statement.
So,
Also in our field, I just wanted to add, in our field we do encourage poetic titles sometimes because we find that people will remember that. So if there's an opportunity to put something in there that is a catchy phrase in our field, people will say, that article on that particular thing. They won't remember your name, but somehow people will pull that. So it depends on discipline.
there's one point here and then one here. Yeah.
I was just going to give you an example of a title I came across once.
Great.
It says, How Gay People Behave at Public Gatherings. And it took me a while for me to discover that what they meant by gay people was happy people.
Ah. Right. Okay. So, takeaway point there, be aware of how terms are used in the international remit. Yeah. Yeah.
Talking of titles, I work with a lot of PhD students, and I find that there are titles that are sort of repetitive, something like a critical analysis of something. Most tables would reflect that kind of phrase, and sometimes it's difficult to see how you can help them there. A critical analysis, an analysis
No,
avoid
being critical. Yeah.
things, but it's very common. We find a critical analysis of things.
Yeah, that's a good. I mean, I think the rule of thumb is try taking a word out. If it still means the same thing without it, then it's probably a good idea to take it out in a title. Yeah. I mean, the word critical can be used as code for other things sometimes, depending on what, so there are more technical uses of critical, but yeah, in a lot of instances, I agree with you.
Listen, comment. How would you tackle this issue? We have said some journals where just after the abstract, we have a set of keywords.
Yeah.
Now we're also talking about having keywords in your title. So what's the relationship there?
Well,
You might end up having to repeat the keywords.
oh, yeah, don't worry about that. I mean, I try to do 6 keywords in under 20 seconds if I'm writing an article. Please do not spend time on this. It counts for absolutely nothing. So, I mean, you are usually required to put them in, but they're very rarely used because search functions now don't only use keywords, they also use your title. So the stakes are very, very low with keywords. And there's absolutely no problem with repeating title words in the keywords, unless you're explicitly told not to, which some journals might do. But yeah, really don't lose any sleep over keywords. Okay. So introductions, again, as I said before, the CARS, this creating a research space, the 3 moves can be a good way of doing introductions. Now, again, there may be lots of different models of introduction that may be appropriate. There's a degree of personal taste in this as well. So some people, we probably have slightly different views on the kinds of introductions we like. I mean, there's a huge difference of opinion over conclusions as well. Some people like really short ones, some people like longer ones. So it's redundant to say that there is no one way of doing this. But my personal preference is that I prefer an open lead-in before I get given the specific objectives or aim of an article. So, you might have a paper that starts, the aim of this article is to da-da-da. But before I see this, I like to have the scene set. So I like to see, a broad opening paragraph that tells us about what's the field we're working on here, what's the debate, what is happening at the global level, what is happening at a local level that has given rise to your research interest. Because something precedes, in real life, something precedes your decision to research a specific thing. So tell the reader what that thing is. It's actually easier to understand. Okay, right, there's this and that, and there's a problem with that. And so I can see now why you've decided to research this at this time in this particular place. The really crucial thing in the introduction is the connection. And this links into our sort of big message for the whole workshop, really, is about how do you take your inevitably local ideas, and that's local everywhere, to the big international audience that you're going to be looking at. So it's the bridging of those things that's really essential in the introduction. You've got your theoretical debate, you've got your policy field, contested field, and then how is your specific piece of research going to speak to that and contribute to that? So it's making that connection. And you might even think of having a connecting paragraph. So you've done the big picture, and then you've got a paragraph that takes that into your specific research, and then you've got another paragraph that outlines exactly what your aims are and what you're going to be doing. One of the challenges of an introduction is that you have to give a little sort of a dash of everything. It's a bit like having tapas in Spain emerged because when people were having a drink before their meal, the chef used to bring out a tiny bit of the main meal on a tapa, which is the saucepan lid, for people to have a little bit of while they're eating. So introduction, you have a series of tapas of the rest of your, because you have to tell the reader something of the literature, because it's part of the rationale for what you're doing. You have to give them just a flavor of what methods you might be using to introduce it, but not fully. And you're also going to give them, a flavor of what you found out, but not necessarily release all of the, the gems at that point. So you've got to give a flavor of all of it, and doing that in a concise, because you don't want to spend too long on your introduction. Doing that in a concise way is a challenging thing about introductions. I would say that there is an element of choice in how much front loading you provide of your argument. So I think it was Stella said, yesterday, it's not a fairy tale. Right? So you don't have to leave everything to a final, neither is it an Agatha Christie novel. Right? You don't have to leave everything for a final denouement. Having said that, you don't need to put absolutely everything in front-loaded in your article. You can release some things as you go along. So there's an element of choice there, but certainly you want to provide some indication for the reader of what's coming. Abstracts are a different matter, though, and abstracts do need to contain your conclusion. So this is a very different. In an introduction, I'd say it's optional. In an abstract, it's compulsory, because you have to have all parts of your argument in your conclusion. And a really important point, do not think that because something is in your abstract, you don't need to put it in your introduction. So sometimes I've had to and fro's with authors where I said, well, you've not stated what your objective is. And then the response will be, well, it's in my abstract. The abstract is entirely irrelevant to what is in your article. You have to put it in the introduction, even if it's in your abstract. Can you just cut and paste from your introduction into your abstract? Well, I don't think there's a ban on it, but it does look a little bit lazy. And it's not usually appropriate because you don't usually write in quite the same way in an abstract as you do in the actual text. You tend to use slightly shorter sentences, more precise sentences in abstract. So it does look a little bit like you haven't been bothered to actually write the abstract. So if you can spare the time to take a completely fresh page and write your abstract without even looking at what you put in the article, I would recommend that. Would the other editors like to add anything on introductions?
You also need to be, I think that's all really important. I think you also need to be thinking, days have gone where people took down a journal issue when it came and they read the whole thing. People are looking, they're searching, you're putting in a search engine, you're getting 200 articles or whatever, which is why the abstract's really important. But, you've got to convince the reader, we've all got shorter attention spans. Why is the reader going to read beyond that introduction? So, some literary quality is also that. I think it's important to get a first version of it, and as the guide to what you're doing. But I think it's worth a bit of polish because it is the first impression the reader's getting of it. You want them to read on. You want them to be excited. You want to claim significance. Going back to yesterday, as I think maybe you said. Of course, you don't have to deliver on it, but you want the introduction to excite people who claim big. They can be disappointed later, but if try to disappoint them later, try to excite them in the introduction, excite them in the main body, and excite them in the conclusion, but at least get them reading it while having the introduction exciting them.
Yeah.
Your last bullet, I'm going to put it as optional, where you say your argument in a nutshell. Because I edited the Usage Humanities Journal for a number of years, and I sometimes found that very problematic, where somebody, the writer says that my argument is this, and I find that the excitement that he was talking about, for me, is gone. Because it has been spelled clearly, this is what my argument is.
Yeah.
And I don't feel like I should go on and read the article because I know it well explained.
So that might be the case. And again, there are some linguistic and cultural differences. So in continental writing, so for example, I interact quite a lot with the Spanish and Portuguese language communities, and it's considered to be very kind of pedestrian to write your argument, because you draw it out gradually. You entice the reader on a journey, and then of course you don't tell them what the final scene is going to be like at the start. So there are some differences. It's quite an Anglo thing to front load an argument, I would say. There are some advantages to it, though, in the sense that you don't want to demand too much of the reader, and all of us are a bit distracted, and you want to help the reader make your argument really clear. So a little bit of front loading can be useful, but I agree with you. You might take the interest out of it if you've given away everything at the start.
Then I want to read it through and find how the author is going to develop the argument. They're going to be faithful to what they said they are going to present.
Yeah.
So this is very discipline specific. Stella and I were talking earlier. You have to also look at it from the perspective of how do you read articles and how do you use articles. So personally, with the exception of my editorial job, I can't remember the last time I read a complete article. That was not mine. That is the reality, right? So I am working on a paper and I'm trying to build an argument on a certain aspect, and I'm doing a literature review on that aspect. I will look at the abstract. If the abstract is relevant, depending on what I'm interested in the methods for the argument. If I look at your argument in a nutshell, I go through and I agree with it, and it's a repeatable journal, and I know it's gone through the peer review process. I don't have to check a lot. The abstract tells me the results, and I can move on from that paper. Maybe I cite it, it supports the argument I'm making, and I move on. Right. So, and some disciplines are different. So some papers I will take a look what analysis did they use. And that's why sometimes, at least in management broadly, it really helps to do it the way President says, because then you still communicate. People don't have to read the whole article. They can take, you trust the journal, you trust the review process, you can take parts of it and be sure that the reviewers ensure that you don't tell a lie up front.
Yeah, please.
I think the general smart thing and takeaway is, what is the practice in your discipline? Number one. And then number two, look at the journal you're targeting. Just take the last year or two and see how the articles are published in the journal, and that will tell you what that editor expects you to do. You have to do that. And so it will vary. And I think that way you won't get in trouble.
Yeah.
You know, one size doesn't fit all.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to do a writing task now. And what I would like you to do is, and we have some time for this, either write an abstract from scratch or take an abstract that you may have drafted and revise it. Okay, so you've got either of those options, but a short one. Let's say maybe, 150 words, something like that. You don't need to do a sort of long abstract. And anyway, most journals like that kind of length. So something that we can write in perhaps about half an hour, something like that. And what I would like you to do is to think about using one or other of the methods. So you could do the IMRAD structure, and I'll put these up. So one very simple way of writing an abstract is just to do one sentence of each section of what you're doing. So you've got a sort of introductory one. What does the literature say? What's your question? What's the methods, findings, and conclusions, implications? So you could just go through very sequentially. That's usually how I write my abstracts. It's a very simple way of doing it. Very crisp, and then you have sort of clear for each one. So that's one possibility. Or you might do your abstract, and it again depends a little bit on your subject matter. You might write a research moves abstract. So you could write it more in the way of this one here, where you're establishing a territory, identifying a gap, and then you're occupying a gap. So sometimes this can work very well as an abstract, particularly if you're enticing the reader in, you're getting them interested in it and showing the importance, because this one is actually much better at showing the significance of what you're doing, because you're really showing the need for it and so forth. So choose one of these two, and then probably the easiest thing is to write a fresh abstract. But if you've got one that you're grappling with, then by all means just take that and then think about how you might adapt it to those. When you've done that, I would like you to swap it with the person sitting next to you. Now I know it's not always an easy thing for us to share our work. We've already had some discussions about this, and if you feel uncomfortable about it, well, there's no obligation. But as far as possible, it would be nice to get some peer feedback on this. So just exchange computers with the person sitting next to you, and give each other some critical feedback. Critical in the nicest sense of the term, hopefully. But hopefully it will raise questions about how others see what we've written, because we're very much inside our own work and our own writing, and it's almost always extremely helpful to have another pair of eyes on it. Were you going to add something, perhaps, Stella?
I just wanted to add to author people. On our draft paper, I have no abstract, so I would like to ask the author people individually to try to draft the abstract for our paper. That
Great.
would be very helpful.
Okay, excellent. Yeah. Are there any questions on the activity? So we have some time to do this. I hope it's concretely useful to you. If you've got papers, do try and do this of a paper that you really want to write, because then you're going to have your abstract there, and we'll have some feedback on it as well. So we have at least half an hour for writing this, and then we've got more time for reviewing it as well.